Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our panel, When Travel Stops, Crisis Response for Corporate Travel Programs. Jen Bankard, Executive Director for Conference Content and Strategy with the BTN Group. So I'll be your moderator for the next hour. So just very briefly before I introduce our panel, just to cover our session housekeeping. Hopefully this spiel is familiar to you by now. But of course, if you feel that you would benefit from the live captioning option that we have available, you can access that through the conference app. And of course, we ask you to add this session to your conference agenda if you have not already done so that you may have the opportunity at the end to rate the session and give us your feedback. So a little bit of background briefly before I let my panelists introduce themselves. This was a session that was not originally on the conference schedule, but in light of the situation in the Middle East, we thought that it was appropriate. We had space on the schedule, so we thought it was appropriate to add this as a last minute session. So first and foremost, I really want to thank the four of you for agreeing to step in really very last minute to share your insights and expertise. And so while the situation in the Middle East prompted this session, and we will certainly make some references to that situation throughout, this is not a session just about what's happening in the Middle East, but I think there are a lot of insights and lessons that we can glean from this to hopefully help us as we move forward. So with that, we're just going to go quickly down the line, and I'd love for my panelists just to share who you are and just give us a little bit of context around where you work, what you do, and what your program is like. So Lindsay, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, hi. My name's Lindsay. I am the security director for assistance in Asia for International SOS. I cover essentially across from China, right across to India, up to Mongolia, and then back down around to Australia and APAC. I've got an extensive history in security, going back for about 30 years. And my last big gig was very much related to the audience, I think, is that I was the head of security for Amazon in Asia Pacific. And so from that perspective, travel management, I can see both sides of the puzzle. I've sort of sat on my side of the fence now, where I'm providing the security assistance, but also on the other side of the fence where I was tracking our travellers and trying to make sure that they were safe on the road. So hopefully I can bring some value here today.
No, absolutely. We're very fortunate to have, like you said, someone who can see both sides of the coin. Alex, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I work for the University of New South Wales in the travel services area. We enable travel for about 8,500 travellers. We do 25,000 trips a year. And our travellers do all the weird and wonderful. We get every kind of destination. We go remote. We go city, whether we're chasing the migration of frogs. Someone's doing a week on base camp at the clinic there. So our travel is extensive. Having our emergency and crisis management policies and procedures is absolutely critical to us. We are 100% safety first.
Thank you so much, Alex. Benoit, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Benoit, I'm the Global Travel Manager for Partners Group. So Partners Group is an investment company. So our travel is a bit more straightforward. It's big business center to big business centers. So traveling either between our offices, we have about 22 or 23 offices all around the world, or to visit clients or investment opportunities. But obviously, finance is always, these big business centers. So it tends to be quite straightforward. We have two offices in the Middle East, one in Abu Dhabi, one in Dubai. And a week before everything started, we just announced that we're opening a new office in Kuwait in a few months. Obviously, this is paused at the moment. We just hired the new head, but now he's starting in our Abu Dhabi office. But yeah, we have big plans to grow in the region. And this is still on track. It's just a pause now. I don't think there is any questions about this strategy long term. But yeah, obviously at the moment, things are a little difficult, so we need to adapt to that.
Thank you, Benoit. And Sohila, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Sohaila Tarabit. I'm the head of corporate travel services for Alfutem Group. So you might not be familiar with Alfutem Group. It's one of the biggest conglomerates in the Middle East. We are headquartered in Dubai, but we also manage brands here in Southeast Asia region, like Robinson, Marks and Spencer, Zara, for example. And I'm very looking forward to our conversation because we don't only travel from and to the Middle East, but we are also living there. So yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yes, and I do want to spend extended special thanks to Suhaila because, as you mentioned, like living in the midst of where all of this is happening, I appreciate your willingness to share, and certainly also recognize that there may be some vulnerabilities. So at any point in time, if it's a question that you would prefer not to answer, that's absolutely fine.
Sure, thanks.
So, knowing that there's probably a lot of diversity in the programs that many of you manage, or that if you're on the supplier side that you support, I thought the best place to start this conversation was how to get started with, creating a solid risk management program for those programs that are less mature. And so I'd love to just go down the line. Why don't we start with you, Suhaila, and come up through Benoit and Alex, and just ask each of you to share what is your, if you had to give advice to the folks in the room who are just getting started, what is that absolute must-have or that one first step recommendation you have for your peers?
So for me, it's to make sure that you limit as much as you can the leakage of your program. You need to make sure that your employees are booking through your approved booking channels. That's really the must-have, because you can have a partnership with international SOS or any other travel security providers, but if your employees are booking outside, it's absolutely pointless. So start absolutely with that.
Thank you so much. Benoit?
Yeah, actually, it's a good question. I started this a few years ago, and for me, my starting point was the ISO standard. I don't exactly remember how it's called, but basically, I went through it. Kind of long. It's an ISO standard, right? So you have to go through 30 pages, but at least it kind of gave me guidance of what we need to do as an organization, because before I started, no one was really doing anything in regards to risk management. Actually, risk management for us as a company means financial risk, looking at a portfolio of assets and figuring out, okay, if something happens, not everybody can crash at the same time. So how do we balance our investment to make sure it's resilient, right? That's risk for us, right? So again, we're in big business centers, so even our offices technically are not really at risk. So it's not really a topic until something happens and people are, oh, what do we do now? So I started with that, and it gives you kind of good guidance. And obviously, you take what you need, and some stuff are not relevant for you if you're not, mining in Africa. Some stuff don't really apply to you as a company. But I felt it was a good guidance to kind of understand what steps we need to take to be more resilient. Yeah.
For those that might not be familiar, can you briefly share what the ISO standards are and what ISO stands for?
I think it's International Standard Organization or something like that. So they do create, standards that are not technically laws, but it could be that if something wrong happened in an organization, the judge would kind of look at what the ISO standard says and take it as a basis to say you did your job as an employer or not, right? So it's always a good basis to, again, you need to take what's relevant for your company, and maybe something you might think, okay, that's over the top, we're not doing that. But I think it's always a good guidance to take a standard that, it's been built by experts and should be, applied, basically.
Thank you for that. Alex, what is your one first step recommendation?
Well, I think in respect of the audience that we have here, that not everybody is a global corporate here. So how do you get started? Your basic foundation is you need to track somehow where your people are. Whether that's on an Excel document, you need to know who your traveller is, where they're going, who have they booked through. Back to Swahili's point is minimize your leakage. You need to track where everybody is at that time. And to follow on from Benoit as well, the international standards, there's an ISO for travel risk management, which is ISO 3130. It's not an auditable ISO, not a certifiable one, but it's a great guideline, and that's scalable. Doesn't matter how big or small you are, will give you a really good guideline into how to put your travel risk management program together.
Thank you so much. And then, Lindsay, from sort of the supplier lens, is there a common gap that you see when organizations first engage a risk provider? What is maybe that tipping point where they say, we need to partner with someone like an international SOS?
Yeah, so for me, the major gap that comes out with people who are just getting into this game is the understanding that there's a linkage here to duty of care to your employees. That's the key piece that really has to go home, particularly to the C-suites who can see this sometimes as a cost that doesn't have a lot of benefit in a majority of cases. But when a crisis happens, that's the last time you want to be trying to think about, okay, how do I deal with this situation at that particular point in time? So for me, it's about using the ISO standard, understanding where that fits in, and then being able to, because that is best practice. That's the basis of the ISO standards, whether they're certifiable or not, is that they are seen as world best practice. They're reviewed on a regular basis, and that's why they're issued. So for me, that's a really good start point. And the second piece there is to link it up to the duty of care and what your posture is as a business and what your C-suites or your leadership team's posture is in the business for duty of care. That will then give you a scope and a complexity that you have to deal with as to how far you need to go, whether it becomes an Excel spreadsheet or whether you need to move into a much more, I won't say much more complex, but a more holistic approach to tracking where your travellers are. And I'm sure we're going to cover that as we go through this conversation. But that's really what I see at the moment as the gaps. We'll move into the crisis management piece, I think, further in the conversation because that is really my expertise. But certainly the business that I'm in is all about being able to posture or being able to assist to posture people into that right space. So if you are a new startup, just getting into this, just venturing in, obviously that's exactly what we do is get people into that space so they're pre-prepared before we launch, before a crisis hits, and then you have to know what you're doing.
So I'm glad you mentioned preparedness. That's always a difficult word for me to say. And talk about, so when a crisis does actually happen, let's talk about that immediate response. So Lindsay, I'll just stick with you first. So again, from that outside supplier perspective, when a crisis hits, walk us through sort of what should be the sequence of actions for a program or organization? What's most time sensitive?
So I think that the most time sensitive piece is there's two things that go concurrently when this sort of crisis hits, or in best practice, this is what I would advise. And that is the two things. One is to track your travellers that you know are out there and try to locate them and ascertain whether they are safe or not. Concurrently with that, what you want to be able to do is activate your own internal mechanisms to go, okay, how are we going to start communicating out to our people, and limit anyone else getting into the danger zone, or what I would call the blast radius of whatever the crisis is. That blast radius that you're there, you don't want other people to add to the problem, so you want to be able to slow them down or get them away or divert them from where they're going. And so there's two aspects there. One is the communications piece, which is quite honestly where I see the most gap in most organisations, is that they don't have pre-prepared communications, at least in the first 30 to 60 minutes or 30 to 90 minutes time frame. Just you can have pre-prepared communications set to go that you build out way before the event actually happens, and you just fill in the blanks. This is the location, this is what's happened, we want you to divert to, and you can just push that communications out. And we'll get into it further, but the channels with which you're communicating, that's the other aspect. Is it via an app? Is it via a WhatsApp group? think that all through before you need to activate it at the time, because if you haven't got that and then you're trying to scramble, you're now trying to locate travelers, you're trying to set up a communications network with them, and you're trying to generate communications, you're really loading yourself up with a lot of a real stressful lot of overhead that's going on, when what you want to be able to do is actually go, okay, how am I going to keep my operations running and my people safe in that particular location, wherever the crisis might have happened?
I think you raise such an interesting point that many of us don't automatically think of. I think generally when a crisis hits, the first response is, who do we have in that location that we need to either find out if they're safe, find out if we need to get them out of there. But it's thinking about who is planning on going to that destination in the coming hours or days to prevent them from traveling potentially. And so then, Suhaila, your earlier point about leakage, that's why we need to know who is going, that we don't want that leakage, because we need to know not just where people are currently, but who's planning to go. Alex, what's your program's immediate response when some sort of crisis occurs that's impacting your people?
Yeah, the immediate response is, as Lindsay says, you find who's in that area right now, who needs the assistance immediately, who do we need to contact now and give them the advice. Once that has been done and is set and is being managed, now we use obviously a provider that helps us with all of that communication. Then myself and my manager on the travel services side, we will start to work with our TMC and we'll start to look who's due to travel, reroute them, who do we need to get in touch with this week, next week, if this goes on a month. So there's two concurrent forms of communication that are happening at that time.
Great. I'm going to send a quick reminder to all the panelists. Make sure you hold the microphone close to your mouth, because when you turn your head, we can't hear you. I didn't know how to tactfully do that, so... Benoit, anything to add that hasn't been mentioned?
Maybe just adding one small thing that was, for me, kind of an eye-opener, especially because, the Middle East being the market it is from a travel perspective, we tend not to think about layovers. We think about someone leaving from London and going to Australia, and we don't think that they go to and maybe they don't even think themselves, right? That I have a layover in Dubai. Oh, wait, Dubai. Oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't do that, right? So you also need to be extremely proactive in that, because they're probably the ones that are not going to think about it. If someone has a flight to Dubai tomorrow, they see the news, they probably react and think, okay, I need to do something here. Of course, it's still your job as an organization to reach out to them, and that you should do that, right? But it's even more important the one going to Sydney that might not think he actually has a layover in Dubai and need assistance to, divert their flight or anything like that. Or they might be at the moment in the airport on the layover, and that's even more critical to make sure you don't forget about these ones. So, that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, that it was a bit more difficult to figure out who is in the region or would go to the region just with a layover and not there as a final destination or origin. So it can be a bit tricky.
Yeah. Benoit, in your organization, how structured is your initial response versus what's just sort of like instinct or like a manual coordination that you come up with in the moment?
Yeah, so instant response is international SOS, actually. So that works pretty well. Then it's the decision making afterwards. What do we do with it? What decisions we're making? Because international SOS doesn't make decision for us, right? They just advise. And that's a bit more like kind of winging it and trying to figure out, okay, who's in charge of that? Who's in charge of that for this region? As I said, as an investment company, we're not very strong in security. Our head of business continuity is IT. Basically, we want to make sure our systems are still operating and that our colleagues can still work, and our business still operate. So it's not very strong into, how do we help human beings, in this situation. So it always takes a bit of digging and making sure someone at the top takes ownership, which is fine. You know, it happens. But it's not as structured maybe as it could be. I can tell you when the crisis started, someone from the local office called me saying, "What do we do?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know. I know that whoever is traveling to the region, I need to get them out. But you live there. I don't know what. If you guys need to get out, I can organize it, but it's not my decision. Someone at the top should say we evacuate our employees in the region or not. I'm just in charge of business travelers." So that was also a bit of an eye opener, saying, "Okay, maybe people on the ground should know who to reach out to when something like that happens, and it's definitely not me. You know, there needs to be a decision from someone else."
So I do want to home in on the current situation in the Middle East. And so obviously, Lindsay, Alex, Benoit, Lindsay, you're here in Singapore, Alex, you're in Sydney, Benoit. Switzerland, thank you. I'm a little tired, guys. I have to be really, really honest. But then, Suhaila, you were on the ground when the crisis erupted. And so from your perspective, what becomes more complicated when you're closer to the disruption itself?
So what becomes complicated is that you work with the travel security partner that advises you to avoid traveling through the region, but we have 35,000 employees based in the region. So like you said, Benoit, we can't talk about evacuation because this is where we live, basically. So where do we go? So I think the main difference is that it becomes very manual for us. And we need to look at things from a very granular level. You were talking about the sequence of things earlier. For us, it's not a sequence. Everything needs to happen at the same time. Communicate to avoid having further travel, but at the same time looking at where travelers are. And everybody has a predefined role. Everything that you tackled so far needs preparation upfront. And luckily, in lack of other words, with the previous attack that happened in June last year, we were able to prepare ourselves and define roles internally. So that's really helped. So yeah, for us, the main difference is to take the information that we have, but at the same time trying to adapt things to the fact that we live in the region. We travel through it, but we live also there. And we had also employees that were in Europe and in Asia at this moment, and their families were in Dubai or in Qatar. And no matter how many missiles were thrown to the region, they just wanted to be with their children and their wives and their pets. So it was also trying to bring people back to an impacted region. That was very, very difficult for us.
I can only imagine, but it makes absolute sense that people want to return home to their loved ones, because that is really how people are going to feel most safe, is when they're with the people that they care about, even if the situation itself is dangerous. So Lindsay, again, you have such a unique perspective. So how, at an overall level, how does managing a crisis differ when you're in region versus managing a crisis remotely?
Yeah, so I can describe what's happened in International SOS because we have an office actually in Dubai, which services the Middle East, and we run it in two ways. So the first one is how do we keep our operations running? And again, this comes back to risk management, because I'm assuming that most of the audience here will be travel managers or of that nature. Perhaps there's some HR splattered in here too. I'm not quite sure. But really, this is all about risk management, and it's about being able to understand where your business is postured for risk before things happened. And so for us, it was a matter of actually we were trying to keep our Dubai office running under the pressure of the drone attacks, things falling out of the sky, the spouses and dependents and so on that were in the country, so the families that are there as well. And there's a layer of psychological pressure that goes onto staff when they're in those locations that you have to be really, really cognizant of. And it all links back to duty of care. I'm going to harp on about this because it is really, that's what your business has got to understand is where's their threshold, what's their settings for duty of care. And one of the really interesting things we were discussing just briefly before we came onto the stage was that when I'm asked by clients now, and I get asked this quite regularly still, but particularly in the first 5-7 days of the crisis, was, hey, should we take our people out? What's your advice? They live there, they've got their families, but should we take them out? Well, that's not our decision as a provider on the outside of the business. That's a business posture, and we can give advice. And my advice on that is around how much dislocation are you going to do for your staff that are living, who want to be there and have a life. In the Middle East at the moment, in Dubai, there is still running water, there is still electricity, there is still a communications network, there is still food, water, and life goes on. It actually goes on quite solidly and safely there. Medical services are still intact. So you've got to then weigh up as a company and as your company posture on your duty of care, I'm going to dislocate people out of their life and I'm going to put them into a hotel in some foreign country for an indeterminate period of time. Is that worse or better than leaving them there with the risk of maybe, and it is a maybe, a drone that's been shot down because none have really got through. Most of them, I think there's only been 2 that I'm aware of that actually got through in Dubai, in the UAE that is, and the rest has been shrapnel falling out of the sky. So what I'm trying to paint here for people who have never done risk management and never done security risk management like this is that's how we as professionals sit back and go, okay, I'm going to paint the landscape for you. As a outside provider, I will paint the landscape and I will show you where your judgment calls are. It's then up to your business posture to understand where does that fit in with their risk tolerances. And like Benoit said, he's in an industry which is finance, which is all about portfolios. It just so happens that I'm in an industry where it goes, people first, then it's operations, then it's your brand. How can I protect my brand? And then it's finally my assets, because most assets are all insured. So if I run through that all the time, that's what I'm running through all the time when I'm working and doing this. This just happens to be people all the time. And that's the way we approach that.
Alex, for you, what are the biggest challenges when the disruption is happening in a different region of the world? Like, how does that feel to be physically removed from it? Is there anything that you think makes it harder or that you miss just because you're not there?
I think this goes back to the communication point of view. It all works well when you can communicate with people. Doesn't really matter if they're in country or not. The worry is when that communication breaks down, then what do you do? That's the challenge. We're slightly different with the university. We had people that were in the Middle East when it happened. We were able to get everybody out very quickly. We don't have anybody that lives in region. With our typical travel to high-risk destinations, we do ask people to check in through the app that is used with our security provider. And that's amazing, and it works really well. One of our challenges is a lot of our travelers go to low-risk destinations. They don't have to check in. We don't always have a complete overview of their full itinerary. So if we can't get hold of them, or they haven't downloaded the app, then it becomes more of a manual process where we're having to go through their historical data, look at their itinerary, we look at what meetings they may have had, following up with them, contacting hotels. It's a very manual process.
It occurs to me that most, if not all, communication we use these days is reliant on technology, whether that's phone, text, email, something through an app. When a lot of the disruptions that have actually started to become more prevalent in recent years are weather-related disasters, And weather-related disasters often lead to long periods of electricity outages. And when you can't charge your phone, or Lindsay, and obviously there was a time and place where we didn't have technology to rely on. How do you revert back to a different form of communication?
I charge by the hour for this one, but that's okay. No. So one
Give
of the
us
things,
just enough to tease us, and then
one of the things that this really links into is preparedness, because most of us know about WhatsApp. If you've got a travel communications provider, there's a number out there. We have our own app as well. All of those things all rely on, as you said, the communications network being intact at that particular time and having some form of connectivity to internet. That's essentially what it comes down to. To implement the alternatives to that, and the quite straightforward one that I used to use in Amazon, for example, was to have a landline set up with an answering machine, which is just a plain answering machine, and you record a message.
Those anymore?
You can just record a message on the answering machine and leave it sitting there on a landline, and people can dial in and listen to that. That still relies on them being able to dial in, but that's a really fundamental form of. But if they don't know that, if they've launched on their trip and you haven't done this preparedness already, and they don't know that there's that number and that they can do this, you're no better off. So that's just an example of where preparedness and being able to make sure that your travellers understand what the fallback plan is well ahead of when it happens, when it's needed. That's the sort of thing you can put in place. We've even gone to the extent of having in some locations just a bulletin board, an old pin-up bulletin board where someone goes down and writes a handwritten note and puts it on there. But everyone in that location knows if everything's out and we need to find out what's going on, that's the place to go, and we'll go to the bulletin board. Might be in a safe hotel. We don't necessarily put it at our offices. We might put it at a hotel, for instance, on their bulletin board, whatever. That's the sort of thing you can put in place. But again, unless you put that in place well before the crisis hits, you're never going to know, and your travellers are never going to know that they're the little tricks that you can put in place. So this sort of comes under the heading of business continuity planning. That's really what this is, and it's done well before the activity. That's the key piece there.
You can send me a bill later for that. I want to dive into traveler tracking and visibility in a little bit more detail, but I want to get some information from all of you in the audience. So, quick show of hands. How many of you feel 100% confident that you know where all of your travelers are right now? Hold it up high. All right, so a little less than half of you. Now let's reverse it, because meetings and events, not always booked within the program. So while many of you booked your own flights to come here, and hopefully you booked that within your program, we booked your accommodation for you. So how many of your companies know all of the details related to your trip here to the show? How many of your companies know where you are? All right, so still not everyone. How many of you who traveled here from another country registered with your local embassy before you left? Gold star on this side of the room. Lindsay, are you surprised by the hands or lack of hands that you saw?
I'm I'd love to. The people who are so confident they know where all their travellers are, I always find that an interesting one, because I can almost guarantee that there'll be someone out there floating around who you won't know where they are. And we've actually got a topic a bit later in the conversation about those particular travellers. But it's heartening to see that people do think that. I do. We've come to Singapore. Singapore is probably the second, I think, or third safest country in the world, period. So I can accept that. I sit here, and again, as a travel, as a security professional, I understand why people go, "Hey, it's Singapore. I didn't need to register with the embassy. I didn't do all the things I would normally do." But 8 weeks ago, 9 weeks ago, what did we think about Dubai? We thought exactly the same thing.
Place.
Exactly the same thing. It's without putting anything out there, it's like the the centerpiece of the Middle East. Everyone wants to go there for a holiday at some point or transit through and stay over, whatever. And that's fundamentally changed. And it changed in, 6 hours? And so I think that, if we take anything away from that is that you can't take anything for granted. And here it may not be, in Singapore, it may not be a war, it may not be conflict, but it could be a natural disaster. And unfortunately in Asia, that's where most of us here live. We are prone to that. And so at the turn of a hat, it could be tomorrow morning we wake up and there's a tsunami coming our way. And suddenly how many of us didn't register with the embassy or, didn't bother doing all the things that we're supposed to do because we thought we were coming to, the third safest country in Asia or in the world, more to the point. And so I think that's the piece that should come out of the Middle East crisis is that just don't take anything for granted.
Suhail, I'm going to move over to you. So when we think about most managed travel programs, and going back to your point about why it's so important to book within policy, book within the program for visibility, we know that there are gaps. Meetings and events is always a big one within organizations. So where do you see systems just fall short in general within most corporate travel programs? Where are those gaps?
So one of the gaps is from the traveler behavior. So we noticed that during the previous crisis in June. We were not prepared at all. Like you said, we think that Dubai is super safe, the Middle East is super safe. So we have our travel security provider, we have our tracker, we think that everything is all right. And then there is the conflict between Iran and Israel, and Qatar got hit. And we look at the travel tracker and we start contacting our travelers, and some of them were supposed to travel or were in Lebanon. And we called them and they were telling us, no, we are in Dubai. But why is your trip still showing in the tracker? So unfortunately, like I told you, Jen, we have some travelers that cancel trips in their head and not necessarily with their TMC. And it's still showing in the report. So this is because they think, okay, maybe I'll travel later, I'll use it later. So we also worked with our TMC to make sure that any trip that gets postponed, but they want the ticket to be active, to remove it from the tracker and really push the cancellations and leave only the trips that are going to be taken in the tracker so that we don't waste time managing that. Now, although you have your system, you have your tracker, I think the difference between being in the region and being outside of the region, when you are outside of a region, you just advise not to travel to the region. And then you look at your tracker, who is going to travel, and then you just support them. But when you are in the region, like I said earlier, a lot of things are becoming manual. And earlier you presented in the AI session that Ben Park was find a way to automate disruptions. Yeah. I really want to talk to him, really, because I need his help. So we needed to look at every single trip that was in the tracker because we had short-term assignments, employees from Dubai that were assigned for 3 months in Saudi, and their trip started before. So these people, we need to leave them there. We don't need to bring them back to Dubai. So you really need to look at every single trip eventually, to make sure that you know who you need to assist. In Saudi, the situation was kind of stable, so we had exceptions for travelers within Saudi. Domestic trips in Saudi could happen if they didn't have a flight, if they were taking a car. So it requires you to, even if you have the technology, you still need to have a lot of manual work and assist really at a granular level.
Alex, how confident are you in your traveler tracking data? And do you still see any gaps, if any?
Yeah, sure. I'm reasonably confident in the data we have. We use a traveler tracking system, so any booking that is made through our TMC is automatically queued through and captured there. We also use our pre-trip approval system, which is managed through our TMC. So we may run a number of reports to cross-reference and to identify Sometimes someone has got an approval to travel, but they haven't actually gone ahead and booked travel. But there's a potential that they've gone outside of policy, they've gone outside of the system, so they may be there. So confident in our data, yes, but also realistic in the fact that we have no control over some humans. And there's possibly somebody else there.
Yeah. Benoit, during our prep call, you mentioned issues like false positives. How does that impact decision making in real time for a program?
Well, first of all, it's a waste of time, right? And during such times, you don't really have much. So that's the first point. I think the second point is maybe it also impacts a bit the credibility of what you're doing, and potentially, people thinking, okay, if they think I'm here while I'm not, maybe they're missing people that are there and they don't know, right? It kind of works both ways. Obviously, you rather have false positive than false negative, and having people there that you don't know about. So rather have it this way. And I do understand why we have this false positive. You never know if someone missed their flight. You need to give it a bit of time and still potentially assume that they could be there longer than expected. We also have a lot of one-way ticket booked, so the technology doesn't always understand that people came back because they have this one way, or maybe it's a bleisure kind of thing, so they came back, but with a private ticket, so you don't see that they go back home or when. So it creates a bit of issues, but I'm still confident that that's not the biggest issue in the program. But it can create a bit of confusion from the travelers or even decision makers. Hopefully, we figured out this false positive before, and then we can make sure that whatever we communicate to management when the decision needs to be made is correct.
So we've mentioned communication a few times, so I want to spend just a few minutes diving into that a little bit more. Suhaila, when we were prepping, you mentioned that your organization has, again, that cross-functional crisis team. What does that look like in practice, and how does that impact communication around a crisis?
So like I said, we have predefined roles. So travel looks after corporate travel and the tracker, and we publish a daily report. So every stakeholder has some data to deliver for this cross-functional team. So travel looks after travel. We have the HSSE team that looks after employees in the buildings. Our HR teams that are looking after employees that are on leave or about to take leave. And communication that manages all the communication. Everything goes through corporate communication, and in our intranet system, we have a page around the regional developments with FAQs, with guidance on travel, and everything related to that. So everybody knows their role. Every day we publish our daily report of people in destination, the ones that are about to travel, the ones that are about to come back. Same for the leave, same for the other KPIs that we are looking at. But we have also included in our crisis management team senior leaders from the businesses. Because although you have recommendations and you are not technically supposed to travel, the business gets impacted. So you also need to have the view from the business to understand to what point, which point you need to reach, to make sure that you allow for some flexibility or not. So you need to involve the business in this cross-functional team.
Lindsay, when you think about your sort of star customers, what do they do well that allows for really good coordination between sort of internal teams and external providers like International SOS? What sets them apart to make things run smoothly?
I think it's a two-way street, to be quite honest, and that it's really, really key that both parties understand what the other. So there's a lot of stakeholder expectation management. So it's understanding what each part of that puzzle and where you fit in and what you can and can't do. So we will often get asked for legal advice, for example, and I'll, we're focusing on the Middle East, but traveling into China is a very, very interesting question that we get asked quite regularly from people from Western nations about, what is the risk for me to travel into China? And that's a really, really interesting question. And we try to provide very, very balanced and very factual information. But sometimes we'll get asked for legal advice. And that's one of those things where we have to go, actually, that's outside of our domain. We can't provide that. You need to talk to someone who's probably based in China and understands Chinese law, but equally that's not our domain. And so that's a really classic case of where right up front, good communications and being able to make sure that both parties understand what is one expecting of the other and what can one of those parties provide to the other. That's probably the key thing for me about our, when you say our star performers, what we can and can't do. The other one is that I think it links back to what Sula was saying, and that is to understand where the operational risk threshold of the particular partner is, because without that, we were again talking before the presentation, if we're talking about scholastics, our scholastic clients, they have a lower threshold, in Asia at least, they have a lower threshold for risk. They will be very, very timid about any sort of travel risk and launching their students into a zone where they're not 100% sure that they're going to be able to get them out, or that the risk there is very, very low. If we then talk about the petrochemical or resources industry, their risk threshold is really, really high. And so why I'm demonstrating those two things is because working with those partners in the way that we do, we need to know where their risk threshold is on the business so that we can provide them the right advice targeted to their particular industries. Some are good at managing that risk, some are not that they're not good at it, they just don't want to manage that risk. They don't want to take that risk on. And that's the key piece for me is understanding that in that relationship.
So we've got about 12 minutes left. I had a very ambitious outline, and I am going to attempt to have us talk about supplier coordination, policy, as well as remote work before we wrap up. So obviously, we've talked about the importance of supplier partners, such as an international SOS, but all of your other suppliers are key in any situation, whether it's your airline partners, your hotel partners, your ground transportation partners, payment partners. So, Benoit, with this most recent situation, was there anything that surprised you, good, bad, or just unexpected, when it came to your supplier performance during recent disruptions?
Yeah, I don't know if it's really a surprise, but it's always a good reminder. And obviously, when something like this happens, priorities are shifting, right? And the TMC, for example, is working much more on immediate cancellations, rebooking, getting people in and out, everything we've been discussed. And someone who needs to book a trip next month to go from the US to Europe should be expected to wait a bit longer. And you'd be surprised that people don't care. They're like, yeah. The worst part is they start by saying, yeah, I know because of the Middle East they're busy, but still, I shouldn't be waiting so long. It's like you just gave the answer to your own complaint, right? So I think there's a lot of, sometimes it's not, of course there's a bit of managing the supplier, but that's kind of obvious, right? And I think everybody knows that in the room, but it's also managing your own population that might not be as well aware of how our industry is working. And knowing that, things are tight. I'm very lucky to operate in a business where we have a 60% margin. No one in the travel industry has 60% margin, right? So they don't have staff lying around just in case something happens that they can pick up the phone within 30 seconds. So for me, it felt it's a lot about managing my people more than the suppliers, to make sure that expectations are kind of aligned based on the situation.
So we need to help them understand that the suppliers are also under great pressure.
I mean, during COVID, as soon as we started traveling again, I received so many complaints of people saying like, why is it taking so long? Why are all these flights disrupted? Blah, blah, blah. It's like, listen, you basically continue doing your work for home for a year and a half. Nothing changed except that you didn't go to the office anymore. You just did your work from home. That wasn't like that in the travel industry, right? To restart everything is a completely different topic. So again, just about education, setting expectations.
Sure. Suhaila, you saw some really great flexibility from certain airlines over the past month. What do you think made that flexibility possible?
Well, to echo what you were saying, Benoit, I think, there is a lot of education to be done with our travelers first, because the first days was absolutely chaotic. Of course, for everyone, nobody was expecting that. And we had people traveling, people trying to come back, and nobody was able to get hold neither of the TMCs, airlines, hotels, didn't know what to do. So they reached out to us, and even on the personal flights, and we were absolutely clueless at this moment. But then I think that particularly Emirates, of course, because we are based in Dubai, so 70% of our spend is with Emirates, but they did a fantastic job. They have an amazing business continuity plan. They allow for cancellations for free, changes up to 10 times if your flight got disrupted. So it was very, very easy to manage. And then with our TMC, also we were monitoring trips week over week. So canceling the trips that were not business critical weeks over week. And it's another KPI that we were following, the level of cancellations, the number of cancellations, the impact on the price, if we were able to get vouchers instead of or credit notes or get full refunds. And honestly, I think that maybe we were able to get 95% back of what we booked. So the suppliers were really, really supportive.
That's fantastic to hear. I want to come back to the business critical travel in just a minute. But Alex, from your experience, how consistent has your supplier performance been? And overall, just how do you decide who you can rely on in a crisis? Is it past performance being indicative of future performance?
Well, I don't know. It's a good stress test, isn't it? This one. It was another incident that happened and impacted everybody globally. It's a good stress test for your TMCs, your providers, your suppliers, and maybe these are things that should be included in your next RFP. These are good questions to be asking your next suppliers and providers. Like, what is your business continuity plan? What happens at the TMC when all your consultants are busy? They're dealing with the situation at hand. But to Benoit's case, we're the same at the university. People traveling in November, December, they still want to book their travel today, now. They want it now. And is your TMC capable of providing those resources to cover that?
So let's talk about policy for a minute. So based on my earlier conversations with the three of you who are buyers on the panel, it sounds like policy just sort of goes out the window because traveler safety is what is most important. Is there someone within your organizations who makes that decision that policy goes out the window, or is it just assumed that that is allowed to happen? Anyone who wants to jump in. You want to start, Benoit or Alex, and then go to Benoit?
I can start, yeah. I think like many decisions we do in our company, it's a bit bottom up. So you need to think about it and say, okay, I feel at this stage, we should let people do what they need to do. If we force them to go to the TMC and potentially wait, 5 minutes to talk to someone,
so you're making
instead
a
of going
recommendation
directly to Emirates to book the flight when it becomes available, because everything's going to be gone in 5 minutes because everybody needs this flight. It's just making sure that you have the backup from management. Mm-hmm. So telling, hey, based on the situation, I inform the team to do that. If you have a problem with it, let me know now, and we're going to find another solution. So just making sure that you have the backup. But obviously you need to react quickly, right? You shouldn't have to do like 20 slides that are reviewed by 3 managers and then, the CEO signs on it and then you're a month later. And so yeah, again, communication, internal communication, making sure your stakeholders are informed and everybody's is on board with that. Um, but yeah, I think it should be expected, and there shouldn't be too much pushback on this. I can tell you personally, so we've done that. We instructed people, book whatever you want, knowing that very likely they would book on the airline website. They might need to book business class or first class if it's the last ticket available. So we raised the limit on their cards. We say, hey, just be mindful. Obviously, you can only put on your card whatever is business expense. That's still the case, but do what you have to do. So yeah, a bit kind of this emergency planning and finding solution to help them do what they have to do.
Alex, anything to add?
Yeah, our policy has been written and decided at a high level that it is safety first, and you do what you need to do to be safe, and we'll work out the finances and the admin afterwards when you're home.
So Hilla, you mentioned switching to business critical travel. So I'd love to hear from, we'll start with you, then Benoit, then Alex. How do each of your organizations currently define business critical travel?
Yeah, so for me, we manage the policy in a total opposite way than you. We reinforced it fully because, your trips are inbound in the Middle East. For us, it's outbound. So like the volume is like that. So we need to monitor absolutely everything. So we already had in our travel policy a concept of traveling when it's business critical only, but it was vague and it was more to support some sustainability objectives that we had and cost efficiency objectives as well. But now we reinforced it to make sure that it also tackles the duty of care. And we didn't define it, to the dot, but because, we have 5 different divisions. So for real estate, business critical is different than for automotive or for retail. So the businesses have to define it, but we were very clear that it really needs to support a business outcome. And we have given the opportunity to the presidents and the HR directors of each division to define what is business critical to them, and they need to approve on top of the normal delegation of approval that we have in our policy. They have to have these additional approvals to be able to book a trip.
So you provide that overall guidance, but then it's up to, like you said, the individual division or business unit to define for their particular part of the company.
Exactly. But this needs to be shared with the TMC. Nobody can book online. We completely closed the online channel right now. So everything has to go offline, and they need to provide all the approvals and then also a proof that they have downloaded the international SOS app on their phone to a mailbox that we have created in our for the travel team. So we monitor absolutely everything, even if it takes time, but we don't want to compromise the safety of our travelers.
How do you monitor if they've downloaded the app? Do you just have them screenshot it and email it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's very manual, but it works.
Yeah. Benoit, how do you define business critical?
Yeah, so for us, it's always a bit difficult, right, from travel to figure out, okay, what is the business really doing? And I can't make a judgment call on, if what they're doing is critical or not. So we have kind of a vague definition that would say anything internal is non-business critical, and anything related to client and investment would be business critical. But then we kind of let them do, the judgment call, right? And that's vaguely what we're doing. We're not really doing that at the moment because, again, our operations in the region is quite small. We're talking about 10, 20 people. So we don't let anybody fly in or through. That makes sense. Anyway, we wouldn't have client meetings or investment meetings in person in the region. But it's just about, people there flying out or maybe flying within the region. And honestly, there, I let them do their own decision, right? I gave them all the information they need. They get the briefings from International SOS. They have any question, they reach out to International SOS, or they reach out to me. But we're not at the point where I would tell them, oh, I know better than you. You're not, they're the ones in the region. They're well informed about what's happening. It's up to them to kind of make this decision. Anyway, it would be only the top managers traveling at the moment. So it's up to them, and we trust their judgment. That's as simple as that.
Lindsay, I have not forgotten you. I'm coming to you as soon as I'm done with Alex. How's business critical defined for University of New South Wales?
Very similar to Benoit, really. Our policy is written that travel must be necessary to the university, must have a reason for that travel. But again, we're not experts in what is business critical, so we leave that to the traveller and their approver to decide that. And then they go through an approval process.
Great. So, Lindsay, something that is connected to policy, although I have a feeling there are still many companies who have not addressed this proactively, but it's come up more in the past few years, remote work, grey trips. So how are those two things complicating duty of care today? And how are you seeing policies evolving to reflect this reality for the customers who have actually taken the time to address it?
So I think to explain what this is a phenomenon that we've seen since the end of COVID and the hybrid working model that's come out, is that many people, and I'm sure, I can put my hand up and say this, that people go on business travel and they might have a weekend off, so they do a side trip. Or they go away and they take their girlfriend or their partner or their family somewhere. And so now we've got a traveller, which we know about, that might well be officially registered, but we're doing a side trip to another country or another location. And that includes dependents or some other person that, when you start looking at what a company's duty of care is on a business travel episode, that sort of suddenly starts extending out to those travellers. And I'll go a step further and say we've got this thing, that phenomenon we've heard about which we know about, which is called hush trips or grey trips. And I don't know, I'm just trying to get a gauge of this. Has people heard of this before, a hush trip or a grey trip?
I was going to say, is that a term that,
Yeah.
raise your hand
People-
if you
people
have
are-
heard the term hush trip or grey trip.
So what
Okay.
this is where, and where this became really relevant and was probably the most confronting that I've seen it so far, was we had flooding last year. Some people who are from this region will know, in the south of Thailand, in an area called Hat Yai. And Hat Yai is like a minor, after Koh Samui, after Phuket and Pattaya, is probably a little holiday destination. And we had a bunch of people turn up there asking for our assistance to get out of the flooding in Hat Yai, who were there hybrid working and had not told their companies that they were there. They were there with their families, on a hybrid vacation / working trip.
A workation.
Yeah, a workation. And suddenly their companies were confronted with this, and essentially it is a bill of, wow, we've got our traveller there who we've sanctioned to be working on a hybrid basis. They haven't told us that they've travelled there, and they're now asking for us to use International SOS, in our case, resources, to evacuate them out of that location. And I flag it with everyone because I think that it goes back to the policy issue, and that is like to just having that understanding that whatever's, and at our level here in this room, it's probably not us, but it's a HR legal, because legal ties into the insurance piece, which is incredibly complex these days because of the Middle East crisis. That's been a direct flow on. But if you start looking at HR, legal, and even operational continuity, those three pieces of the business, this has really transformed, I think, hybrid working and the risk attached to hybrid working in the travel space and the duty of care space has really transformed what we're dealing with. And I think it's only a matter of time before we're going to see, and Hat Yai was my first really serious exposure to it. I'd heard of it when I was working in Amazon as head of security there, but not to the extent that came out of the woodwork in Hat Yai. And to give you an idea, we had a female there who was asking for assistance. She got stuck in the hotel with a 1-year-old baby and her whole family. So she had 3 other kids. They had no running water, no power, and her phone was going flat, and she needed baby formula to keep that child alive. And it was like, wow, how do we do that? That became what we would call an imminent, threat to life situation. And that company was they were they had no idea she was there. They had no idea that she was functioning in that capacity or in that part of the world. But it was all according to policy, and it was all according to her hybrid working contract that she had. But again, it was just so far out of left field, and then that became a real nightmare for us to solve for them. So I just flag it as something that, as people who are in the travel industry and managing that sort of stuff, this is a phenomenon, and it's something that we should be trying to work into our policies and make sure at least we're cognizant of who's where and what, when I say the blast radius and what the scope of the problem is that we're trying to deal with. If you have a blast radius, at least have the travellers say, hey, I've got my girlfriend with me, I've got my boyfriend with me, whatever it might be, and I've got my kids, whatever, and I'm in this location. Or at least we know what the blast radius and what the damage is going to be, and then we can go from there.
So we have to wrap up because we are over time. So just one final question, and I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to answer. Just one thing you think the audience should prioritize before the next crisis hits, and we'll just start with Lindsay and go down the line.
Just don't assume that places are safe and everything's normal again. I think that's the one key piece to take away, and try and be prepared. Try and look at, use the Middle East as a model and do some preparedness now. It's already underway. That's cool. But, for the next thing that happens, let's do some preparedness.
Thank you. Alex?
Use the real-life scenarios as an educational piece for your travellers to really promote their communication and letting you know where they are.
Benoit?
Yeah, I think for me, one learning was to know who the decision makers are. Because if you spend, 2 hours to try to figure out who you need to reach out to, it's, time lost when you don't have it. So,
Suhail?
Same, then Lindsay, prepare. And even if you are prepared, be ready to have to improvise all the time. Although you have a plan, be ready to, I'm an ex-Amazon also, Lindsay, so bias for action, be ready to take decisions without clear circumstances.
All right, fantastic. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Many thanks to the panel. If we could give them a round of applause. So please do give us your feedback on the session. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and join us back here shortly. We have one more panel session where we'll get to hear from our 3 APAC Travel Buyer of the Year finalists who are doing some really innovative work in the region. And then at 4 o'clock, we will have our awards ceremony where we'll announce our Innovation Face-Off winners as well as the APAC Travel Buyer of the Year. So thank you so much.